Imagine drifting off to sleep in a small medieval cottage. The night is quiet, save for the soft rustle of straw in the corner. And then a faint scratching sound. You open your eyes and see two glimmering dot-steiny eyes reflecting the moonlight. A rat. In the Middle Ages, that sound wasn't just common, it was constant. Every home, every granary, every ship, and even the grandest castle was alive with the quiet scurry of small, hungry feet. Tonight, we're going to travel back to that world. A world before pest control, before disinfectant, before even the faintest idea of bacteria. Where people didn't just live near rats, they lived asterisk with asterisk them. In cities overflowing with waste, in dark alleys thick with filth, and in the rafters above sleeping families, rats thrived. They were everywhere, and dealing with them was a never-ending battle of superstition, survival, and strange invention. As we explore how people really dealt with rats in the Middle Ages, you'll discover how the humble house cat became a hero, how rat catchers roamed towns armed with sticks and spells, and how the mysterious Pied Piper may not have been just a fairy tale. You'll see how fear, faith, and ignorance combined to create both tragedy and strange creativity in the war against one of history's smallest, deadliest enemies. Before we begin, make sure you're comfortable. Let your body sink into the bed, your breathing slow and deep. If you enjoy learning about strange and forgotten corners of history while you drift into sleep, please take a moment to subscribe to History for Sleep. It helps the channel grow and lets me bring you more calm journeys through the past. And as you listen, I'd love to hear from you. What time do you usually fall asleep to these stories? And what period of history would you like to explore next? Leave a comment and let me know. I read every single one. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine the dim glow of a tallow candle flickering against stone walls. Outside, you can hear the squeak of a cart, the whisper of wind, and somewhere nearby, the faint scurry of a rat. Let's begin our journey into how people really dealt with rats in the Middle Ages. The medieval city never truly slept. Even as the sun dipped behind the thatched rooftops and the church bells tolled for evening prayer, life continued in its restless rhythm. Fires still burned in the baker's oven, the blacksmith's forge hissed and cooled, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at something unseen. Beneath it all, there was another sound, one so ordinary that most people stopped noticing it long ago. The soft, persistent rustle of small bodies moving in the dark. Rats, thousands of them, hidden beneath the floorboards, inside barrels, and behind walls that leaned with age. By daylight, the medieval city was chaotic, vibrant, and foul all at once. The streets were narrow and crooked, barely wide enough for a cart to pass. Wastewater flowed down open gutters that ran through the center of the street. People tossed kitchen scraps, spoiled meat, and chamber pot contents directly out their doors, calling a warning to any passerby below. It was a world ripe for scavengers, and the rats thrived in it. Every dropped crust of bread, every forgotten fish head, every pile of straw soaked in ale or milk, it was a banquet waiting to happen. Rats were not just nuisances. They were neighbors, living closer than anyone liked to admit. You might wake in the night to find one tugging at the edge of your blanket, or hear the soft squeal of a fight breaking out behind the hearth. They chewed through wooden barrels to reach stored grains, gnawed through leather sacks, and made nests in thatched roofs and the corners of pantries. Many people tried to drive them away, but just as many accepted their presence as inevitable. In a time when clean water was rare and disease a daily threat, rats were simply part of life, unwelcome, but constant. If you walked through a medieval town after sunset, you'd see the signs everywhere. Shadows darting across the base of a wall, the squeak of something small underfoot, piles of grain spilling from split sacks near the market stalls. The smell, a mix of human waste, rot, and damp, straw clung to everything. People often covered it with the scent of smoke or herbs, But even that could not hide the sharp, musky odor of vermin. For the poor, whose homes were made of wattle and daub with earthen floors, rats were especially bold. They tunneled straight through the walls, stealing food and even nesting inside bedding. In winter, they crept closer to the fire's warmth, sharing space with the families huddled against the cold. Children sometimes treated them as pests to be chased for amusement, throwing pebbles or sticks, but adults understood that killing one rat rarely mattered. For every one you saw, there were dozens more hidden in the walls. The wealthy fared little better. Though stone houses and castles offered sturdier protection, they also provided endless hiding places, storerooms, cellars, granaries, and kitchens filled with food. Servants were often tasked with keeping these areas clean, but clean, in the medieval sense, was relative. A swept floor and a burning hearth were the extent of sanitation. The rats remained, nibbling at grain barrels and leaving their droppings across stone floors polished by centuries of use. Even in monasteries, where order and discipline were sacred, rats feasted in the cellars and kitchens. The monks complained in their records of gnawed parchment, ruined food, and sleepless nights filled with scratching sounds. At night, the city became their kingdom. When humans withdrew indoors and candles burned low, the rats emerged without fear. They ran along rafters, across rooftops, and through alleys, an unseen tide of movement. Cats prowled, but they could never catch them all. Dogs barked, but grew weary of the chase. And the people too tired, too accustomed, simply slept through it, pretending not to hear. The sight of rats wasn't considered shocking or unnatural. They were part of the medieval ecosystem, as ordinary as flies or crows. To many, their presence was simply proof that food and life still existed in abundance. If rats thrived, it meant there was something left to eat. Yet beneath that acceptance, a quiet dread grew. Everyone knew that where rats gathered, sickness often followed. Though few understood why, they sensed the connection. The arrival of too many rats was a bad omen, a whisper of something dark on the horizon. Imagine walking through one of those narrow lanes late at night, your only light a flickering lantern. The stones beneath your feet are slick, and the air smells of damp earth and smoke. From the shadows, a dozen tiny eyes watch as you pass. The rats are not afraid. They've seen humans before, countless times. They know your habits, your smells, your weaknesses. In the silence between the distant toll of bells, you can hear them, the quiet, steady movement of a city alive, even after dark. This was the backdrop of medieval life, a place where man and vermin shared the same space, each struggling to survive in their own way. The people of the Middle Ages did not yet know the science behind infection, nor could they imagine that these small, persistent creatures would one day bring ruin to entire cities. For now, they were simply part of the night, a familiar sound, a common nuisance, and a reminder that no matter how grand or humble your home, you are never truly alone. As the candlelight flickers low, imagine those medieval streets fading into darkness. Listen closely, and you might hear it, the soft rustle in the straw, the faint tap of tiny claws. The city sleeps, but the rats never do. Long before the medieval towns of Europe were overrun with the soft scurry of rats, they came from far away. Their journey began in the shadows of the East, along the trade routes that carried spices, silk, and stories between worlds. The black Rattus rattus was not a native of northern Europe. It came from the warmer lands of India and Southeast Asia, where it had already learned the art of surviving among humans. Wherever humans stored grain, the rats followed. They were the quiet passengers of history, unseen stowaways on the caravans and ships that bound the ancient world together. As trade expanded, the rats traveled along with it. Merchant ships that set sail from the ports of the Middle East and North Africa carried goods, and with them, uninvited guests hiding among the barrels and ropes. Rats needed little to survive: a bit of food, some warmth, and a place to nest. In the dark belly of a ship, they had all of that. They gnawed through sacks of rice and wheat, bred in the shadows, and spread their young across the seas. When those ships reached Constantinople, Venice, or Genoa, the rats disembarked with the sailors, blending into the bustling markets and warehouses. By the time the Middle Ages were fully underway, rats had conquered Europe. They thrived in every port city first, Marseille, Lisbon, London before, moving inland along rivers and trade roads. In medieval Europe, food storage and sanitation were primitive at best. Grains were kept in open lofts or wooden bins. Waste was thrown onto the streets or into nearby rivers. The rat, clever and opportunistic, found endless opportunity in this new environment. It multiplied faster than anyone could control, creating colonies that lived right alongside the people who had unknowingly brought them there. No one in medieval Europe understood this migration in the way we do now. They didn't know that the rats had come from far away, nor that they carried with them more than just fleas and disease. They carried a new chapter of human history. To the people who first encountered them, rats were simply there, as if they had always been. Chroniclers never wrote of a sudden invasion. Instead, the creatures crept quietly into existence, becoming part of the everyday landscape of life, their origin a mystery lost in the folds of time. In monasteries and ports, records describe the growing problem of the great mice, a term often used for rats before the word rat became common. The monks who stored their harvests noticed new kinds of gnawing marks on their grain sacks, larger than those of field mice. Bakers complained of ruined flour. Even the docks began to echo at night with the sound of scratching beneath the planks. By the 12th century, the rat had settled comfortably into European life. These creatures were remarkably adaptable. They could swim across rivers, climb rough stone walls, and squeeze through openings no bigger than a thumb. A single rat could climb into a cart or crate and find itself miles away by morning. Entire families of rats could hide in bundles of hay or woven baskets, traveling unknowingly with merchants and farmers. Once they found a new place to live, especially one filled with food and warmth, they multiplied rapidly. A pair of rats could produce hundreds of offspring in a single year. And so, quietly, the rat claimed dominion over the medieval world. Their rise was unstoppable, partly because medieval people had little understanding of infestation. There was no concept of pest control, no sanitation laws, no organized effort to clean the streets or store food securely. The rat was a perfect fit for such a world a survivor in the chaos of human neglect. Where people built cities, rats followed. Where people hoarded food, rats feasted. And where people slept, rats prowled just beyond the edge of candlelight. There were stories, whispered among travelers and sailors, about the uncanny intelligence of these creatures. Some claimed rats could sense storms before they struck, leaving ships moments before disaster. Others said they had leaders larger, darker rats that commanded the rest, guiding their movements through towns and ships alike. To those who watched them, the rats seemed coordinated, purposeful. Their presence hinted at something more than mere instinct, and that sense of eerie cleverness added to the growing discomfort people felt toward them. As rats spread through Europe, they carried more than just a nuisance. Hidden within their fur and on their fleas were invisible killers, the bacteria that would one day bring the world to its knees. But in these early centuries, that future was still waiting. For now, rats were only one of many challenges of medieval life, blending into the background of a world that accepted filth as a fact of existence. Imagine a merchant returning from a long voyage, his ship creaking as it enters the harbor. The crew unloads crates of spices, silks, and precious stones. They cheer, glad to see home again. But unseen among the ropes and sails, a few small shapes scurry down the mooring line. Within days, they'll find a warehouse. Within weeks, they'll be nesting in homes. The people will never notice them, at least, not until they begin to hear that familiar scratching in the walls. The rat had arrived in Europe, not as an invader, but as a fellow traveler. It came quietly, stealthily, surviving on the scraps of civilization. And once it found its place in the medieval world, it never left. The story of how people dealt with rats begins here, with their arrival, their acceptance, and the slow realization that they were not guests passing through, but residents who had come to stay. To understand how rats flourished in the Middle Ages, one must first understand how people lived. The medieval world was a place of astonishing beauty and breathtaking decay, cathedrals rising to the heavens beside gutters filled with waste. For every golden chalice in a church, there was a heap of rotting refuse in the street. It was a world without plumbing, without garbage collection, and without the faintest notion of modern hygiene. And for the rat, it was paradise. A typical medieval town was crowded, alive, and perpetually unwashed. Streets were narrow, often no more than a few feet wide, hemmed in by leaning timber houses whose upper stories nearly touched. The air hung thick with the smells of wood smoke, dung, and sweat. People lived cheek by jowl with their animals' chickens underfoot, pigs rooting through refuse, and dogs sleeping beside hearths. Wastewater from homes and workshops flowed into open ditches that wound through the streets, carrying filth toward the nearest river or stream. In theory, this kept things clean. In reality, it simply spread the stench. Every day, housewives emptied chamber pots into the gutters. Butchers dumped the remains of slaughtered animals, bones, fat, and blood into piles behind their shops. Tanneries soaked animal hides in urine and lime, filling the air with an acrid sting that made travelers gag. In such an environment, rats did not need to search far for food. They had everything they needed right where humans lived. Even in the wealthier quarters, life was not much cleaner. The stone streets might be swept, but the refuse simply collected in corners or flowed toward the lower districts. In castles, chamber pots were emptied into moats or courtyards. In monasteries, latrines were often built over rivers, where waste could float downstream, though not nearly fast enough to prevent the smell. Rats swam through those same waters, feeding on scraps that washed their way. From there, they would climb back up into storerooms, granaries, and kitchens. Inside homes, the situation wasn't much better. Floors were often made of packed earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes. The straw absorbed spills, food crumbs, and waste from both humans and animals, creating the perfect nesting ground for fleas and vermin. People replaced these rushes only a few times a year, if that. Imagine layers of old straw, damp and rotting, teeming with life you didn't want to see. Rats burrowed through them with ease, building tunnels and raising their young beneath the very feet of sleeping families. Furniture was simple wooden chests, benches, and beds filled with straw. Clothing and blankets were rarely washed. Soap was expensive, and water was often dirty. People bathed infrequently, sometimes only a few times a year. The combination of filth, warmth, and stored food made every home an open invitation for rats. They feasted on crumbs from the table, gnawed through wooden barrels to reach flour, and sometimes even chewed the bindings of books or parchments to make bedding. The medieval attitude toward cleanliness was complex. People didn't see dirt as dangerous. They saw it as inevitable. To be clean was a luxury, not a moral good. What truly mattered was order and ritual purity, spiritual cleanliness, not physical. The church preached that disease was a punishment for sin, not a result of filth. And so, people prayed more often than they scrubbed. They burned incense to hide the smell of rot. They trusted that holy water could ward off illness better than soap ever could. Yet even in this world of grime, people were not entirely blind to the dangers of decay. They knew that rotting matter bred worms and flies. They noticed that stagnant air made them sick. They could see that food spoiled faster in the heat, and that foul odors often preceded disease. But lacking the science to explain why, they did what they could, hanging herbs to sweeten the air, lighting fires to drive off the stench, and sweeping away the worst of the filth when it became unbearable. Rats, however, were beyond their control. They were part of the fabric of life, an ever-present shadow in every barn, cellar, and kitchen. Markets were among the worst offenders. By midday, the stalls were thick with scraps of meat, spilled grain, and spoiled produce. Rats feasted openly, darting between baskets and barrels as merchants haggled above them. Cats stalked through the chaos, but they could only catch a few at a time. At night, when the stalls were shuttered and the torches went out, the real feast began. The sound of claws and gnawing teeth filled the darkness as hundreds of rats emerged to finish what humans had left behind. For medieval people, rats were so common that they rarely merited attention unless they caused direct harm. A missing loaf of bread or a hole in a sack was annoying, not alarming. People accepted loss as part of life. Only when the rats grew too bold, biting sleeping children, chewing through stored grain, or spreading sickness, did fear take hold. Imagine the air of a medieval town at dusk, the bells tolling in the distance, smoke curling from hearths, the chatter of neighbors drifting through open shutters. Beneath all that, the faint sound of movement, tiny claws over wood and stone, the squeak of young rats calling in the dark. They were the hidden citizens of the Middle Ages, thriving in the filth that humans left behind. And while people lived among their waste, they unknowingly created the perfect kingdom for these creatures. The more crowded and unsanitary the cities became, the more rats multiplied. The relationship was simple and tragic. The filthier the world of man, the richer the world of the rat. As night deepens and torches burn low, the medieval streets fall silent again. But beneath the stillness, life stirs a shadow kingdom, beneath the feet of humankind, alive with rustling and whispers. It was here, in the filth and the dark, that the great war between humans and rats truly began. For most people in the Middle Ages, the presence of rats was not limited to the streets or barns. They were an intimate part of daily home life. When night fell and candles flickered low, the rats came out. They scurried across rafters, ran over straw floors, and sometimes brushed past sleeping bodies in their endless hunt for food and warmth. For the poor, especially, there was no barrier between themselves and the animal world. They lived side by side with their livestock, fleas, and vermin. Rats were just another presence in the household, though never a welcome one. Medieval homes were small and simple. A single room might serve as kitchen, bedroom, and storeroom all at once. The hearth at the center of the room provided both heat and light, but it also attracted rats, who loved to nest in the warm ashes once the fire cooled. Bread, grains, dried meats, and cheese were kept in sacks or earthen jars, but these were no match for the sharp teeth of a hungry rat. Even when hung from beams, food was not safe. Rats could climb anything: rope, wood, plaster walls, even the coarse fabrics of hanging tapestries. Families grew used to the soft sounds of movement at night, the scratching, squeaking, and occasional thud as something small fell from a shelf. Some people claimed rats would nibble at their hair or toes as they slept, mistaking the scent of sweat for food. Others said they'd wake to find tiny bite marks on their fingers or ears. These stories might have been exaggerated, but not by much. Historical records include occasional accounts of rats gnawing at the faces of infants or the hands of the dead, especially during times of famine when food was scarce. To keep rats away, medieval people employed every trick they knew. Some placed bowls of ashes or sand beneath their beds, believing rats disliked the texture. Others scattered herbs like mint, tansy, or wormwood, hoping the smell would drive them off. Cats were the most common defense, nimble, patient, and ruthless hunters. Many families kept one for that reason alone. Cats earned both affection and suspicion, especially from the church, which sometimes linked them to witchcraft. Yet no one could deny their usefulness in keeping rats at bay. In towns and farms alike, a good mouser was prized as much as a strong ox or loyal hound. Still, cats could only do so much. Rats bred faster than they could be caught. For every nest destroyed, several more went unnoticed. In grain stores, rats tunneled into barrels, gnawed through lids, and spoiled entire harvests. A single family of rats could ruin a winter's worth of food within weeks. People sometimes built hanging cages or suspended their food in baskets from the ceiling to keep it safe, but rats were clever and persistent. They learned to climb ropes, leap from beams, and chew through bindings. Even wealthier homes struggled. Stone walls might have kept out thieves, but they offered no defense against vermin. Rats found their way through cracks, chimneys, and drainage holes. In manor kitchens, where the smells of roasting meat and baking bread filled the air, rats feasted on scraps that fell beneath the tables. Servants spent their nights sweeping floors and setting traps, simple contraptions made from wooden boxes and bits of cheese. But even these were often futile. Rats were cautious creatures, quick to learn and hard to fool. Children sometimes turned the war against rats into play. They'd chase them with sticks, shout warnings to their mothers, or even keep a captured rat in a small cage for amusement. Some poorer families resorted to eating rats in desperate times, roasting them over the fire like small game. Chronicles from famine years mention such things without judgment. When survival was uncertain, nothing was wasted. What made the rats truly unnerving was their silence and cunning. They seemed to know when humans slept and when the house was still. They moved like ghosts, unseen but always near. You might wait to find droppings near the bread loaf or a small hole chewed into the bottom of a chest. In the morning light, you could follow the faint trail of gnaw marks leading into the darkness behind the wall. People began to associate rats with the devil's trickery creatures of the night that slipped through cracks no one else could pass. In some regions, families developed rituals to protect their homes. A common charm involved writing a prayer on parchment and burying it under the threshold to keep vermin from crossing. Others made small wax figures of rats and burned them while reciting psalms. These acts blended faith and fear, superstition and desperation. For medieval people, the boundary between the physical and spiritual world was thin, and even something as mundane as a rat infestation could take on a mystical meaning. Imagine lying in bed on a cold winter night, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket. The hearth fire has burned down to embers. The only sound is the wind outside, and then, faintly, the soft patter of claws on wood. Something shifts in the shadows. You hear a squeak, quick and sharp, followed by the rustle of straw. You know what it is, but there's little to be done. You pull the blanket higher and try to sleep. The rats have come again, as they always do. This was daily life for countless people in the Middle Ages. An uneasy coexistence with creatures that thrived in their homes, fed from their stores, and haunted their nights. No one escaped them completely, not the farmer in his cottage, nor the noble in his hall. The rats had found their place in the heart of the medieval household, bold and relentless. And as long as people lived in warmth and clutter, the rats would never leave. In time, people would turn to faith, folklore, and profession to fight back. The struggle against these household intruders would grow into a trade, a superstition, and even a symbol of evil itself. But for now, as the candlelight fades and sleep beckons, the house belongs to them. In the Middle Ages, the church touched every part of life, from birth to death, from the harvest to the hush of evening prayer. It shaped how people understood the world around them, including the smallest and most despised of creatures. Rats, with their dark, darting movements and eerie persistence, were not merely animals to the medieval mind. They were signs, symbols, perhaps even punishments. And within the walls of cathedrals and monasteries, the faithful sought to explain their presence through the only language they knew: faith, sin, and divine will. To the church, the natural world was a reflection of the moral one. Every beast, bird, and insect had a place in God's creation, a purpose within the grand design. But what of the rat, that unclean and destructive creature? Its purpose, priests and monks believed, was to remind humanity of corruption, of sin gnawing away at the soul, just as rats gnawed through grain and wood. In sermons, preachers compared rats to the devil's servants, whispering temptations and spreading decay wherever they went. As the rat devours what is stored, wrote one cleric, so too does sin consume the treasures of the spirit. The association between rats and evil grew strong in the medieval imagination. In illuminated manuscripts, artists sometimes painted rats lurking at the edges of scenes depicting gluttony or greed, their black forms symbolizing moral decay. In church carvings, tiny rats or mice can be seen nibbling at fruit or crawling beneath the feet of demons, a warning that even the smallest evils could infest the purest soul. The rat became a living metaphor, a creature of shadow, feeding on the waste of the world. Yet, paradoxically, rats were also seen as part of God's creation, and thus subject to his law. There are records of priests performing formal excommunications of vermin. In some regions of France and Switzerland, rats were actually summoned to court. Clergymen read charges aloud, accusing them of destroying crops or spreading disease, and then, in solemn ceremony, they were banished from the town by decree. The absurdity of such trials did not seem strange at the time. It was an attempt to impose divine order on chaos. If humans could sin and repent, perhaps even rats could be commanded to obey the will of God. Monasteries, ironically, were among the worst places for rat infestations. They stored grain, cheese, dried fruit, and parchment, an irresistible combination for rodents. Monks often wrote about their nightly struggles with rats in their journals, describing how the creatures chewed at the bindings of sacred books or stole crumbs from the refectory tables. The monastic silence of the night was broken only by the scratching and squeaking from the shadows. Some monks tried to drive them away with prayer. Others relied on cats, though even these holy halls were not immune to superstition. A black cat might be seen as a witch's familiar, yet it was still tolerated if it caught enough rats. There were moments when the church's view of rats turned from symbolic to apocalyptic. During outbreaks of disease, such as early plague episodes before the Black Death, rats were seen as harbingers of divine wrath. Their sudden appearance in large numbers was taken as a sign that God was displeased. People turned to priests for guidance, carrying out processions, fasting, and prayers to drive away both the vermin and the anger of heaven. They sprinkled holy water around homes and granaries, believing it might purify the air and cleanse the infestation. In theological writings, rats were often grouped with serpents and toads, animals thought to have been corrupted by the fall of man. They were unclean, not only because they lived among filth, but because they represented what humanity feared most: persistence of sin. They thrived where people failed to maintain purity, whether of the body or the soul. A clean home was not just comfortable, it was righteous. A filthy one was a sign of moral decay, and the scurrying of rats in the rafters seemed to confirm it. But not all churchmen saw the rat only as evil. A few natural philosophers, curious about God's creation, argued that even the lowest creature had divine purpose. Rats, they reasoned, taught humility. They reminded humans that perfection was impossible in this world, that no matter how grand a cathedral or pious a monk, corruption would always find a way in. The rat was a lesson wrapped in fur and darkness, a symbol of man's fallen nature and the unending need for redemption. Imagine a monk kneeling in a candlelit chapel, the sound of evening prayer fading into silence. From the corner of the room, he hears the faint scratch of tiny claws against stone. His eyes flick toward the movement, And there, just beyond the circle of light, a rat darts past the altar and disappears into the shadows. For a moment, the monk wonders, is it merely a creature of hunger, or a messenger from the unseen realms, reminding him of the fragility of order amid chaos? In this way, the Church gave meaning to the infestation that plagued medieval life. The rats became part of a moral landscape, a reflection of humanity's constant battle with temptation, decay, and disorder. They were both real and symbolic, a presence that gnawed not only at food stores and walls, but at the very heart of the medieval imagination. And as the centuries passed, that spiritual understanding would blend with superstition and folk belief, creating a strange mixture of faith and fear. In the next chapter, we'll see how people tried to make sense of the rat beyond the church's walls through the curious, often bizarre science of the Middle Ages. Before the modern world could name bacteria, before microscopes revealed the teeming universe of the unseen, the people of the Middle Ages tried to explain the mysteries of the natural world with imagination and inherited wisdom. Their science was an intricate blend of observation, superstition, philosophy, and faith. When it came to rats, those tireless thieves of the night, people were desperate to understand where they came from and how to make them disappear. The result was a strange, fascinating collection of theories and remedies that reveal as much about medieval thought as about the rats themselves. In an age before germ theory, everything was guided by the ancient principles of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease and decay were believed to come from imbalance. Rot, filth, and foul odors were signs that the humors of a place were disturbed, that the air itself was corrupted. The concept of miasma bad air dominated medical thought. People believed that sickness came not from creatures like rats, but from invisible vapors that rose from waste and decay. Rats, it was thought, were merely symptoms of this imbalance. They appeared where the air and earth were already diseased, drawn by the same corruption that afflicted mankind. So if rats came from corruption, what could drive them away? Some medieval thinkers believed that rats were literally born from it. According to the ancient naturalist Pliny the Elder, certain animals could spontaneously generate from decaying matter. His writings, copied and recopied through centuries, told that mice and rats might be born from moist soil mixed with refuse, or from rotting hay and sweat. Many scholars accepted this without question. In their minds, the sudden appearance of rats in a cellar or granary was proof that the earth itself could give birth to vermin. This theory made rat control seem hopelessly difficult. How could one fight an animal that rose from the dirt itself? Instead of focusing on killing rats, many medieval scientists turned their attention to purifying the environment. If filth created rats, then cleanliness, or at least the medieval idea of it, could drive them away. People burned aromatic herbs such as rosemary, juniper, and sage to cleanse the air. They scattered ashes, salt, or powdered sulfur around rooms, believing these substances repelled both disease and vermin. The smell of smoke was thought to purify the spirit as well as the body, so homes and streets were often filled with thick scented haze. Others turned to astrology for answers. Every creature, they believed, was ruled by the stars. Rats, being creatures of darkness and secrecy, were said to be under the influence of Saturn, a planet associated with decay, death, and melancholy. Thus, certain lunar phases were thought to encourage rat infestations. Farmers would mark the moon's cycles to decide when to store grain or set traps. Some manuscripts even offered astrological charts predicting the most unfavorable times for vermin, advising people to take precautions when the moon waned in Capricorn or Scorpio. Folk healers and early alchemists added their own interpretations. Some claimed that rats could be lured away with music, not unlike the later legend of the Pied Piper. Others swore by concoctions that would turn their hearts to flight. One recipe called for boiling mint, garlic, and vinegar together and smearing it on doorways. Another suggested sprinkling ground snake skin mixed with ashes over the floor. There were even claims that drawing chalk circles and inscribing secret words could keep rats from crossing a threshold. These rituals blurred the line between science and sorcery, between medicine and magic. In the manuscripts of medieval scholars like Albertus Magnus and Hildegard of Bingen, rats appear occasionally as subjects of natural inquiry. Hildegard, the famed Benedictine abbess and polymath, described them as creatures of the damp, drawn to moisture and decay. She advised sprinkling wormwood and tansy in homes, herbs believed to repel all manner of pests. Her writings show the early stirrings of empirical thought observation born from experience rather than myth. She did not yet know about disease or contagion, but she understood that filth and dampness brought trouble. Yet for every practical idea, there were a dozen fantastical ones. Some believed that rats could be driven away by loud noises or by hanging a dead rat in the doorway as a warning to others. Others thought that the presence of certain saints' relics could ward off infestations. Churches sometimes placed relics near their grain stores, trusting in divine protection as much as in earthly measures. The logic was simple. If God ruled all creation, then holy objects must command even the humblest of creatures. The pseudoscience of rat control reflected the medieval way of thinking, symbolic, interconnected, deeply moral. Every pest, every storm, every sickness was part of a divine pattern. If rats swarmed through your home, it was not just a physical problem. It was a sign that something in the order of life had gone astray. Perhaps the air was bad, or your soul was troubled, or the heavens were in an unlucky alignment. The response, therefore, was not just to trap or kill, but to cleanse, to pray, to rebalance. Of course, rats continued to thrive despite all these efforts. The herbs dried, the prayers faded, and the scratching in the walls returned. But in the flickering candlelight of the medieval home, people clung to their rituals with quiet faith. The world was full of mysteries, and the rat was only one of many. Picture a scholar in his study, surrounded by scrolls and ink-stained pages. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, he dips his quill and writes carefully, Asterisk, the rat is born of corruption and moistness, and he departs when the air is pure. Asterisk behind him, in the shadows, something moves, a faint rustle, a flick of a tail. He does not turn around. In the Middle Ages, even the learned could not escape the creatures they studied, and so the theories persisted, part truth, part superstition, all woven into the fabric of medieval life. But while scholars wrote and healers burned herbs, others faced the rats directly. The next chapter tells the story of those who made the fight against vermin their life, worked the rat catchers of the Middle Ages. Before traps, poisons, and professional exterminators, the medieval world relied on its oldest allies in the war against rats animals. Nature, in its quiet wisdom, had already provided mankind with guardians perfectly suited to the task: the cat, the dog, and the ferret. Each one played a role in the age-old struggle to keep vermin at bay, though their place in medieval society was as complicated as it was essential. The cat, sleek and silent, was the most iconic of these defenders. To the medieval eye, cats were mysterious creatures, aloof, watchful, and somehow untamed. They prowled the shadows of barns, kitchens, and granaries, their eyes glinting like green glass in the firelight. They hunted without instruction or reward, killing mice and rats with swift precision. In the countryside, a good mouser could mean the difference between stored grain that lasted through the winter and starvation before spring. Farmers learned to respect them, even if they never fully trusted them. But not everyone saw cats as saviors. The church's relationship with cats was uneasy. Their independence and nocturnal habits gave rise to suspicion. In religious imagery, they sometimes appeared alongside witches or demons, symbols of pride or deceit. The color black, associated with night and mystery, made the black cat especially feared. Yet even when condemned from the pulpit, cats were quietly tolerated, because no sermon could protect a monastery's grain from a determined rat. Records from abbeys across Europe mention cats being kept in storerooms and refectories, often given names and even burial spots when they died. There is a curious tenderness in these accounts, as though the monks knew they relied on something half-wild and entirely necessary. Dogs, on the other hand, played a more varied role. They guarded doors, herded livestock, and sometimes joined in the chase. Certain breeds, small and agile, were prized for their ability to hunt rats. The ancestors of today's terriers began their work in this era snapping at rats in barns, kitchens, and city alleys. These dogs had boundless energy and courage that bordered on madness. They could flush rats out of burrows and kill several in minutes. In towns, ratting dogs became common companions for tradesmen, guards, and travelers who slept in roadside inns. Yet dogs were also noisy and disruptive, less suited to the quiet persistence of a monastery or the narrow confines of a noble's kitchen. They were kept outdoors or in stables, where their barking could drive away intruders of all kinds, human or otherwise. In ports and warehouses, dock workers kept dogs to protect cargo from rats as well as thieves. A few historical records mention competitions, where owners boasted about how many rats their dogs could kill in an hour. These events were not yet the cruel spectacles they would become in later centuries, but were rooted in the same grim necessity: survival against infestation. Then there were the ferret's small, sleek hunters with a reputation as both cunning and uncanny. Ferrets had been domesticated long before the Middle Ages, used by Romans to hunt rabbits and rodents. Their slender bodies could slip through burrows, holes, and cracks that no cat or dog could reach. In medieval Europe, ferrets were used especially by those who made a living controlling vermin: rat catchers, millers, and grain merchants. The creatures were nimble, fearless, and perfectly suited to the labyrinthine spaces beneath floors and behind walls. To work with ferrets required a certain temperament. They were unpredictable, quick to bite, and often preferred the thrill of the chase to the reward of food. But in skilled hands, they were invaluable. Rat catchers would release them into walls or storage rooms, blocking the exits with sacks or nets. Moments later, the rats would burst forth in panic, only to be clubbed or snared by the waiting humans. Ferrets were also kept in ships and granaries, where their keen sense of smell helped locate hidden nests. The relationship between people and these animal defenders was pragmatic rather than affectionate. Cats and dogs were fed scraps, not pampered. Ferrets were kept in cages and handled with care but little sentiment. Yet in their quiet way, they formed one of the earliest partnerships between humanity and the animal. Kingdom, a mutual struggle for survival in a world of scarcity and decay. Superstition wove itself through this partnership as well. A cat that refused to hunt might be seen as cursed or bewitched. A dog that growled at shadows was thought to sense spirits. Some believed ferrets carried the souls of thieves, doomed to hunt forever in the dark. Despite these beliefs, people could not deny the practical power of these creatures. When all else failed, when herbs, prayers, and charms proved useless, it was the hunters on four legs who kept the rats in check. In the glow of a hearth, you can almost imagine the scene: a peasant woman mending clothes by the fire, her cat curled nearby, its tail twitching as it watches the corner of the room. Outside, the wind howls through the thatch. A sudden squeak, a blur of motion, and the cat springs. The struggle is brief. She mutters a word of thanks and tosses the dead rat into the ashes. The battle is endless, but tonight, at least, she has won a small victory. Through centuries of coexistence, these animals earned their place not just in homes, but in folklore and art. The cat became both feared and revered, the dog loyal and tireless, the ferret mysterious and clever. Together, they formed the first line of defense in a war humanity didn't fully understand, but could never stop fighting. Yet even with their help, the rats persisted. They bred faster than cats could hunt, hid deeper than dogs could dig, and returned no matter how many were slain. The medieval world needed something more, a dedicated hand, a human profession born from the shadows of this eternal struggle. And so, from the filth and fear, emerged a new kind of worker, the rat catcher. Among the most curious and grim professions of the Middle Ages was that of the rat catcher. He was both feared and needed, a wanderer who walked between the worlds of pestilence and survival. When the scratching in the walls became too loud, when the grain stores began to empty, or when the smell of decay grew too thick, it was the rat catcher who was called. He arrived with his sack, his stick, and sometimes a small collection of cages or trained animals. He was not a man of faith or science, but of experience, someone who knew the ways of the rat better than any scholar or priest. The rat catcher's work was dangerous, filthy, and strangely respected. To live among rats was to flirt constantly with sickness and superstition. Many villages viewed these men as necessary evils tolerated, but rarely welcomed. They came and went like ghosts, often sleeping in barns or abandoned huts at the edge of town. Yet when they appeared, the people gathered around, whispering tales of their trade. Children would stare wide-eyed at the skins or cages they carried. The rat catcher, with his patched clothes and sharp eyes, looked half like a magician, half like a beggar. His tools were simple but ingenious. Most carried a long stick or club, sometimes tipped with metal for quick killing blows. Some used nets woven from coarse rope or wire, which they spread across granary doors or placed around openings. Traps were crude wooden boxes balanced on sticks, weighted with stones, or iron jaws that snapped shut with terrifying force. Bait was usually grain or cheese, though the best rat catchers swore by strange mixtures of bacon fat and herbs. But the true skill of a rat catcher lay not in his tools, but in his knowledge. He knew where the rats nested behind hearthstones, under floors, within walls. He could tell by the faint marks on wood or the smell in the air how large an infestation might be. Some even claimed to speak to the rats in whispers, luring them out with clicks of the tongue or strange little songs. Others carried ferrets or terriers, letting them loose in barns while they waited outside, sack in hand for the rush of fleeing rats. There was a rhythm to the work, a grim dance of noise and movement. The rat catcher would close the doors, block the cracks, and stir up the nest with his stick. Suddenly, the room would come alive, rats, squealing and leaping, scattering in panic. The air would fill with the smell of dust and fur, the slap of tails against stone. In moments like that, chaos ruled, and the rat catcher had to move quickly, clubbing or trapping as many as he could before the survivors vanished again into the shadows. Payment was rarely generous. Villagers offered coins if they could spare them, or food and ale if they could not. Some rat catchers sold the skins, drying and stretching them for merchants, who used the fur to line gloves or hats. Others captured live rats and sold them to towns where rat-baiting contests provided grim entertainment. In the flickering firelight of taverns, people gathered to watch dogs or cats set upon caged rats, shearing as though it were a sport. The rat catcher supplied the players for these brutal games, making profit from the creatures he was sworn to destroy. The profession carried an air of dark magic. Many believed rat catchers could command the creatures with spells or curses. There were stories of men who could clear an entire village simply by whistling a tune or drawing symbols in the dust. These tales would later give rise to the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a mysterious figure who led the rats away with music. Whether such powers were real or merely the embellishments of frightened peasants, they reflected a truth. To most people, the rat catcher seemed to move between the natural and the supernatural. Despite their low status, rat catchers had a strange kind of authority. They understood something the rest of society did not: the secret lives of the unseen. They knew how quickly rats could breed, how cleverly they could hide, and how even a single survivor could begin the cycle anew. Their trade depended on understanding the rhythms of decay, the habits of the unwanted. In this sense, they were among the first field naturalists, though their work was born of necessity rather than curiosity. It was not a job without cost. Many rat catchers bore the scars of bites and scratches that festered for weeks. Some fell ill from disease, wasting away before their time. Others were run out of towns when fear or superstition turned against them, especially during plagues, when people sought someone to blame. Still, there were always more to take their place, drawn by the promise of coin and the grim certainty that rats would never vanish. Imagine him at dusk, a lone figure, walking down a muddy lane, his shadow stretching long behind him. His clothes smell of smoke and death. In one hand he carries a torch, in the other a stick darkened by use. Around his waist hang pouches that jingle faintly with traps and bones. He pauses at the edge of a barn, listening. There it is, the faint rustle of straw, the squeak of life hidden in darkness. He nods to himself, lights his torch, and steps inside. The rat catcher worked in the forgotten corners of medieval life, his presence a grim reminder that filth and hunger were never far away. To the people, he was both hero and omen, a man who brought relief, but also the scent of decay. And though his task was thankless, he kept returning, drawn like the rats themselves to the endless struggle. But not everyone relied on rat catchers or animals to fight infestations. Some turned to more dangerous, desperate methods, mixtures of herbs, minerals, and poisons that promised to rid homes of vermin, often at great risk to those who used them. In the next chapter, we descend into the world of medieval rat poison, where alchemy met desperation, and death was both the cure and the cost. As the Middle Ages wore on, the battle between man and rat grew ever more creative and dangerous. For those who could not afford a cat or a rat catcher, or whose barns were too large and dark to police by torchlight, there was one last resort: poison. Medieval people experimented endlessly with concoctions designed to kill or drive away vermin. Some were crude but effective. Others were as deadly to humans as to rats. In the flicker of a smoky candle, they mixed powders and brews, trusting more in rumor and superstition than in knowledge, and hoping the smell of death would fall upon the creatures before it reached them. Rat poison in the Middle Ages was rarely a single recipe. It was a collection of local traditions, passed by word of mouth. One of the oldest methods involved a blend of ground herbs mixed with flour or honey to lure the rats in. Common ingredients included hellebore, hemlock, arsenic, and quicklime substances known for their bitter taste and deadly effects. Hellebore, a winter-blooming plant, was prized for its toxic root. People ground it into a paste, shaped it into small pellets, and scattered it near walls or holes. Hemlock, which had once killed the philosopher Socrates, found a new use in peasant cottages. Its seeds were mashed into a grim porridge, left in bowls overnight, and gone by morning along with a few of the household's smallest thieves. But these methods were unpredictable. The same poisons that killed rats could kill cats, dogs, or children. Arsenic was the most dangerous of all. It appeared in apothecaries under the name *ratsbane*, sold to those who could pay. White and powdery, it could be mixed with grain or milk to create a silent killer. There were whispered tales of wives who bought arsenic for the rats and found other uses for it. In an age without regulation, the line between vermin poison and murder weapon was frighteningly thin. Not all poisons were meant to kill. Some were designed to drive rats away with strong odors. Medieval people believed that smell had spiritual power, that bad smells could drive away disease, and good smells could ward off evil. They burned sulfur, camphor, and tar to fumigate their homes. Some sprinkled crushed mint and lavender near food stores, while others used vinegar-soaked rags. One curious remedy involved placing onions stuffed with garlic and pepper in the corners of rooms. Supposedly, the pungent fumes would offend even the boldest rat. In larger towns, rat catchers and apothecaries sometimes joined forces, selling specialized mixtures. These rat powders were made in secret, their recipes jealously guarded. Some claimed their poisons could wipe out entire nests within a day. Others promised that the rats would flee in terror rather than die. A few of these formulas worked, but just as often they caused unintended chaos. One famous account from 14th century Paris describes a merchandise cellar filled with poisoned grain that rotted so foully it made the entire house uninhabitable. The rats died, but the smell lingered for months. The blending of medicine, magic, and murder fascinated medieval minds. People believed that the right combination of words and ingredients could give any substance greater power. Thus, many poison recipes included a spoken charm. A housewife might whisper, "In Christ's name, let the devils flee," as she laid down her bait. A monk might bless his herbs before crushing them with a mortar. Even the rat catchers muttered incantations while preparing their brews. To the medieval world, faith and poison were not opposites. They were partners in the eternal struggle against corruption. Alchemy played a role as well. The alchemists, those secretive seekers of transformation, saw rats as symbols of decay, the very essence of what they sought to purify. In their laboratories, they experimented with mercury, lead, and antimony, believing these metals held the key to understanding both death and rebirth. Some of their experiments accidentally produced substances toxic enough to kill vermin instantly. Others produced only strange fumes and explosions. Yet out of their curiosity came progress. The early alchemists, fumbling in the dark, laid the groundwork for the chemistry that would one day identify poison with precision. For the common folk, though, knowledge was practical and hard-earned. They observed that certain powders worked better when mixed with sweet foods or warm milk. They noticed that rats avoided fire and smoke, so they burned their poisons to spread the fumes through narrow alleys and granaries. In some villages, people even believed that chanting while setting out the poison made it more powerful, a kind of spiritual warfare against the forces of filth. The danger, however, was constant. Poisoned food sometimes found its way back to the humans who had set it out. Cats died after eating tainted rats. Dogs sickened from licking up spilled grain. Even people fell ill from handling arsenic without understanding its power. Entire families could be poisoned by accident, their sickness blamed on bad air or witchcraft. The cure for vermin often became a curse. Still, the temptation to use poison was irresistible. It was the closest thing to control that medieval people had. To see the rats dead was to reclaim a sense of mastery over the unseen, the rot, the stench, the disease. Every successful batch felt like a small victory in a world that seemed always slipping toward chaos. Imagine the scene: a cottage kitchen lit by a single tallow candle. A woman grinds herbs in a small wooden bowl, the air thick with the scent of bitter roots and vinegar. She moves quietly, glancing toward the shadows where movement stirs. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. She sets her bowl near the hearth and waits. Somewhere in the dark, a rat sniffs the air. Soon, the scratching will stop for a time, but she knows they will return, as they always do. The poisons and potions of the Middle Ages tell a story of desperation wrapped in ignorance. They reveal how deeply people feared the creatures that shared their homes, and how far they would go to destroy them. But they also show something more enduring: the human desire to impose order on chaos, even when that order came with a terrible price. In the next chapter, the line between truth and legend blurs entirely as we explore one of history's strangest tales, the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, and how it may have begun with nothing more than a plague of rats. There are few tales from the Middle Ages as haunting or as enduring as that of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Even centuries later, the image of the mysterious figure in brightly colored clothes, leading a swarm of rats through the winding streets of a German town, still lingers in the imagination. It is a story that has crossed from legend to lullaby, from mourning to bedtime fable. But behind its melody lies a darker echo of truth born from the real and desperate struggle of medieval people against the creatures that overran their lives. The story, as it is most commonly told, begins in the town of Hamelin in the year 1284. The town was said to be suffering under a terrible plague of rats. They infested homes, grain stores, and even the church, devouring food and spreading fear. The people prayed, pleaded, and tried every remedy they knew, but nothing worked. Then one day, a stranger appeared. He was tall and thin, dressed in garments of vivid colors, a pied or multicolored coat. He carried a small pipe at his side and spoke with quiet confidence. For a fee, he promised to rid the town of its rats. The desperate townsfolk agreed, and so the stranger began to play. His music drifted through the streets, strange and lilting, weaving between the houses like a living thing. From every crack and corner, the rats emerged, hundreds, then thousands, pouring into the streets in a churning tide. They followed the piper as he walked, his tune rising and falling in mesmerizing rhythm. He led them through the gates of the town, down to the river Weser, where he stepped aside and continued to play as the rats plunged into the water and drowned. When the last tale disappeared beneath the surface, he stopped playing, turned, and walked back into town. But when he returned for his payment, the people refused. They mocked him, some saying the rats were gone because of their own prayers, others simply unwilling to part with their silver. The piper's face darkened. Without a word, he left the town. Days later, he returned, but this time he played a different song. As the music echoed through the streets once more, it was not rats that followed, but children. They came from every home, laughing and dancing, their faces entranced. The piper led them beyond the walls, into the hills, and they were never seen again. That is the legend as most know it, a strange blend of triumph, betrayal, and loss. But beneath the fairy tale surface, historians have long searched for meaning. Was it truly about rats, or was it something else? The earliest written accounts of the Hamelin story, recorded in the 13th century, make no mention of rats at all. They speak only of a mysterious figure who led the town's children away. The rats were added later, perhaps in the 16th century, when the story was retold in the context of the great rat plagues that swept across Europe. The image of the piper driving out rats became a perfect metaphor, an echo of the countless rat catchers who wandered from village to village, promising miracles for a price. Some scholars suggest the story may have roots in historical tragedy. Perhaps the children were not children at all, but the youth of Hamelin men and women who left the town to colonize new lands in Eastern Europe. Others see it as a parable of death, linking the piper to the figure of death itself. In medieval art, death was often depicted as a musician, leading people away in a macabre dance. The rats, when added to the tale, turned the story into an allegory for plague death luring humanity into the grave with a melody they could not resist. Whatever its origin, the tale resonated deeply with medieval audiences. They understood the terror of infestation, the desperation that might drive a town to pay any price for relief, and the fear that salvation could come with a hidden cost. To them, the piper was not just a mythic figure, he was the embodiment of a truth they already knew, that when rats invaded, something precious was always lost, whether it was food, health, or innocence itself. The symbolism of the pipe was powerful. Music was believed to have magical properties, the ability to heal, to soothe, or to harm. The piper's melody, irresistible and dangerous, echoed the relationship between man and pest, an endless cycle of attraction and destruction. In some retellings, the piper is even described as a servant of the devil, his tune a spell that compels obedience. In others, He is a betrayed hero, taking vengeance on a town that broke its word. Each version reflects a truth about the age and era haunted by famine, disease, and mistrust. Imagine the streets of Hamelin on that fateful morning. The fog hangs low, the air thick with the scent of water and grain. From somewhere unseen, a faint, eerie tune begins to play. The townspeople pause, listening. Then, from every alley, the rats appear wave after wave, drawn by the sound. Their claws click against the cobblestones, their bodies moving like a living river toward the musician who waits at the gate. To the medieval mind, it would have seemed nothing short of a miracle. But the miracle turned dark, as so many did in those days. Whether it was a punishment, a warning, or simply the cruel whim of fate, the story of the Pied Piper endured because it captured something universal, the price of betrayal and the thin line between salvation and loss. Centuries later, travelers to Hamelin could still see an inscription on the town as Old Gate. Asterisk. In the year 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul, 130 children of Hamelin were led away by a piper and were lost. Asterisk. Even now, no music is played on that day within the town. So, was the Pied Piper real? Perhaps not. But his legend, born from the fear of rats and the desperation to be free of them, carries a truth more enduring than fact. In the darkened towns of medieval Europe, where every rustle in the walls might herald sickness or death, who would not dream of a man who could simply play the rats away? Yet, as history would soon show, not even the most enchanting song could silence the plague that came next. The rats, silent carriers of doom, were about to deliver a horror that would reshape the world. In the next chapter, we step into that shadow, the time when the rats brought death itself, the age of the Black Plague. By the mid-14th century, the familiar scratching of rats in the walls had taken on a new and terrifying meaning. For centuries, they had been an accepted nuisance, a part of daily life, a symbol of filth and sin, but rarely more than that. Then, seemingly overnight, they became messengers of death. The disease that swept through Europe from 1347 onward, the Black Death, transformed the ordinary rat into a creature of dread. Where they appeared, people whispered, sickness followed. Villages emptied, cities fell silent, and the world seemed to stop breathing. It began, as so many medieval tragedies did, with trade. Ships from the east brought not only silks and spices, but unseen passengers hidden in the dark spaces between barrels, rats and their fleas. The bacteria Yersinia pestis unknown to science for centuries to come, lived in those fleas, waiting for the warmth of blood to awaken it. When infected fleas bit rats, the rodents sickened and died, but before dying, they carried the disease into homes, stables, and ships. When the rats themselves perished, the starving fleas sought new hosts. And so the infection leapt from rat to man, from man to family, from town to kingdom. The first signs were small. A few dead rats in the street, a strange smell in the air. Then came the fevers, the swellings beneath the skin-painful buboes that gave the plague its name. The sickness spread faster than anyone could understand. Entire households fell ill overnight. Priests and physicians died as quickly as their patients. In towns like Florence, Paris, and London, bodies filled the streets faster than they could be buried. Chroniclers struggled to describe it. Men and women alike dropped as if struck by arrows, wrote one monk. The breath of the dying was death itself. To the medieval mind, the connection between rats and disease was unclear. People saw that the vermin multiplied in the same places where plague struck, but they did not know why. Some believed the rats carried evil spirits. Others blamed the stars, the sins of mankind, or the wrath of God. Many fled the cities in panic, only to carry the infection into the countryside. The air was thought to be poisoned, and so people burned herbs, sage, juniper, rosemary, to cleanse it. They wore masks stuffed with flowers, carried posies, and avoided the touch of strangers. But the rats followed, silent and unstoppable. The fear of infestation turned into obsession. Every sound in the night became a warning. The faint patter of claws, once ignored, now sent chills down the spine. People smashed walls, burned bedding, and sealed cellars, believing the rats themselves were cursed. In some towns, guards were posted at the gates to stop the entry of grain carts, fearing they might carry the plague. Sailors began to dread the sight of rats on deck, calling them omens of doom. A creature that had once been an accepted part of life was now the very image of death itself. Yet not all of this fear was misplaced. In hindsight, modern science has shown that rats did play a crucial role in spreading the Black Death, though the story is more complex than it first seemed. The fleas carried the true infection, but the rats were their bridges, bringing the plague from ship to shore, from home to home. When the rats died in great numbers, the fleas turned to human hosts. Thus, the rat's own suffering marked the beginning of human tragedy. In some parts of Europe, people noticed that cats seemed to slow the spread of the sickness. Villages that valued their Mausers fared slightly better than those that killed them out of superstition. In other areas, panic turned to cruelty. Believing that animals spread the disease, towns ordered the killing of dogs, cats, and any other creatures suspected of harboring evil. Ironically, this only worsened the problem. Without their natural predators, rats multiplied unchecked. The cycle of fear fed itself, and the plague continued. Descriptions from the time are filled with both horror and resignation. Priests wrote of rats falling dead in the streets by the dozens, their bodies bloated and oozing. In Florence, chroniclers recorded how the animals would crawl into houses, die beneath the floorboards, and fill the air with an unbearable stench. In London, city officials offered coin for every dead rat brought to them, though few dared touch the creatures. The connection between death and vermin was undeniable, even if its cause remained hidden in mystery. As the plague ravaged Europe, art and literature began to reflect its shadow. Painters depicted rats among skulls and skeletons, symbols of decay and divine punishment. Writers described them as servants of the devil, agents of pestilence sent to punish mankind for its pride. The rat became more than a pest, it became a moral symbol, a living embodiment of the rot within society itself. Imagine the stillness of a medieval street during the height of the plague. The church bells toll endlessly, marking not the hours, but the dead. Doors are shuttered, windows boarded. The air is heavy, thick with smoke and fear. Somewhere nearby, a sound breaks the silence, the soft scurry of tiny feet, the squeak of a creature that survives where men cannot. In that moment, the rat becomes both witness and survivor, moving through the ruins of a dying world. When the plague finally began to fade, Europe was forever changed. Entire towns were gone, fields lay untended, families vanished from memory. Yet the rats remained. They thrived amid the emptiness, feeding on what was left behind. The survivors, haunted and humbled, looked upon these creatures with new eyes, seeing in them the reflection of their own endurance, their own fragility. The Black Death did more than decimate a continent. It reshaped the human relationship with the natural world. The rat, once an unseen neighbor, had become a symbol of mortality itself. It was no longer merely an inconvenience. It was a reminder that even the smallest, most despised creature could bring empires to their knees. And yet, in the centuries that followed, the fear of rats would not fade. Instead, it would evolve, mingling with superstition, religion, and even persecution. In the next chapter, we explore how humanity's desperate search for answers led them to blame the wrong enemies, turning fear into cruelty and ignorance into tragedy. As the Black Death spread like a shadow across Europe, it brought with it more than fever and death. It brought confusion, terror, and the desperate need for answers. The human mind cannot live long with uncertainty, and in the absence of knowledge, people reached for explanations that fit the world they knew. But the world they knew was ruled not by science, but by faith and fear. So when the rats and fleas went unseen, people turned their gaze toward themselves, their neighbors, and the heavens, searching for someone or something to blame. The first and most common explanation was divine punishment. From the pulpit, priests declared that the plague was God's wrath for the sins of humanity. They pointed to greed, lust, and pride as the cause of the world's suffering. Processions filled the streets, long lines of barefoot penitents chanting hymns, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of mercy. Some towns organized days of fasting and prayer. Others burned incense to cleanse the air. When the pestilence persisted, despair turned to anger, and anger turned outward. Foreigners, the poor, and the marginalized became targets. Jews, in particular, were accused of poisoning wells and spreading disease. Across Europe, from Germany to Spain, massacres erupted. Entire communities were wiped out by mobs, convinced they were eradicating the source of the plague. It was one of the darkest chapters of the Middle Ages, a tragedy born from ignorance and fear. Ironically, in many of the Jewish quarters, the plague's impact was slightly less severe, perhaps because their religious laws encouraged cleaner living and better water practices. But in the hysteria of the time, reason had no place. Animals, too, bore the weight of suspicion. Cats, long associated with witches and dark spirits, were hunted and killed in droves. Black cats suffered the most, their color seen as proof of their infernal connection. In some towns, dogs met the same fate. The irony was devastating. By destroying the very creatures that kept rat populations in check, people only worsened the spread of disease. But such logic could not survive in a world blinded by terror. Even the natural world was not spared. Comets, eclipses, and unusual weather were seen as omens of divine anger. Astrologers blamed the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, claiming their alignment had poisoned the air. Physicians, clinging to their understanding of humors and miasmas, advised people to avoid the corrupted winds. They carried posies of herbs, sat between fires to cleanse the air, or fled to higher ground. Some cities even banned the ringing of church bells, believing the sound disturbed the heavens. The true culprits, rats and their fleas, went unnoticed amid this frenzy. People saw the rats dying but misunderstood went. Some believed the rats absorbed the poison of the plague and died to protect humanity, while others took it as a sign of the world's decay. No one thought to link the tiny bites on their legs to the sickness that followed. In a world without microscopes, the leap from flea to fever was too far to imagine. In the great cities, the fear took on its own rhythm. In Florence, smoke filled the streets as people burned juniper branches to cleanse the air. In London, the smell of vinegar and Uranus-opposed purifier hung thick over the markets. In Nuremberg, the town council forbade the sale of second-hand clothing, thinking the plague clung to fabric. None of it mattered. The rats kept coming, drawn by food and filth, thriving in the chaos humans created. The chroniclers of the time recorded these acts with sorrow and disbelief. One monk wrote, "Men seek the source of their suffering in their brother's blood." Another, in France, noted bitterly that the people have killed the cats, and yet still the vermin thrive. These accounts reveal a dawning realization that humanity was fighting the wrong war. In their zeal to purify their souls, people ignored the true, silent enemy crawling beneath their feet. Superstition and religion intertwined in strange and tragic ways. In some places, people held rat trials, summoning the creatures to appear in court and answer for their crimes. Priests read formal decrees of banishment over the infested fields, commanding the rats in God's name to depart. In others, they exorcised homes as if ridding them of demons, sprinkling holy water and chanting psalms. These rituals offered comfort, if not results. They made people feel less helpless in the face of invisible death. Imagine a small medieval village surrounded by fields gone untended. The church bell tolls for another funeral. The priest stands at the altar, his voice hoarse from prayers. In the flickering light of candles, the congregation listens as he declares the plague a test of faith, a punishment for sin. Outside, rats slip through the churchyard, darting between the gravestones. Their tiny paws leave prints in the soft earth of the freshly dug graves. No one notices them. All eyes are turned heavenward, searching for answers that lie, quite literally, beneath their feet. This misdirection, the blaming of the wrong culprits, did not end with the plague's first wave. For generations afterward, the same patterns repeated. Disease struck, and humanity turned inward, seeking moral explanations for biological mysteries. Rats and fleas remained ever present, invisible links between the squalor of human life and the spread of sickness. Only centuries later, with the rise of scientific observation, would the truth begin to emerge. The cost of those centuries of misunderstanding was staggering. Entire communities vanished. Innocent lives were taken in the name of purity. And yet, amid the devastation, humanity learned something profound, that survival required not just faith, but understanding. Slowly, painfully, the medieval world began to open its eyes to the idea that the smallest creatures could wield the greatest power. In the next chapter, we leave the streets of the common towns and look upward to the stone walls and candle-lit halls of the powerful. Even kings and queens, for all their wealth and grandeur, were not spared the creeping terror of rats. For in the Middle Ages, not even a crown could keep them out. It is tempting to imagine that the great castles of the Middle Ages, those towering fortresses of stone and power, stood apart from the filth and hardship of the common world. From a distance, their battlements gleamed above the valleys, symbols of strength and safety. Within their walls, nobles dined on fine meats, slept upon feather beds, and wrapped themselves in furs. Yet behind the grandeur, beneath the carved ceilings and woven tapestries, another world thrived, a world of scurrying feet, gnawed wood, and restless scratching in the dark. For even in castles, the rats reigned. The great halls of medieval castles were built for defense, not for cleanliness. Thick walls kept out enemies, but they also trapped moisture and darkness. Food stores were vast, kitchens always warm, and refuse abundant. Barrels of grain, salted meat, and cheese filled the cellar's perfect shelter for vermin. The floors, though stone, were often covered with rushes, strewn with herbs to sweeten the air. Those rushes quickly became nests. Beneath every tapestry, behind every chest, rats built their hidden empires. Servants were the first to notice. They slept in small quarters near the kitchens, where scraps of bread and spilled broth fed an entire ecosystem. The gnawing of wood and the squeak of rats were as common as the creak of doors. Cooks waged a daily war, hanging meat from the rafters and sealing flour in wooden boxes bound with iron bands. But nothing was ever truly secure. Rats could climb stone walls, slip through cracks no wider than a thumb, and squeeze through drainage holes. In the stillness of night, the grand kitchens echoed with their quiet movements. Even the nobles could not escape them. Chronicles from the period tell of lords waking to find rats in their chambers, drawn by the scent of food or the warmth of a fire. One account, written in a 14th century French manuscript, describes a lady of high birth who screamed when she discovered a rat tangled in her hair as she slept. Her attendants rushed to her aid, but by the time they arrived, the creature had vanished into the tapestries. In another tale, a king's feast was disrupted when a rat fell from a beam onto the table, sending courtiers scrambling as it darted among the platters. Castles were, in many ways, miniature cities. They contained stables, bakeries, breweries, armories, and granaries, all under one roof or within the outer walls. Each of these places offered shelter and sustenance to rats. The grain stores were particularly vulnerable. A single family of rats could ruin an entire season's worth of harvest. Rats gnawed through sacks, soiled the food, and spread disease among the animals. In the stables, they fed on hay and grain meant for horses, sometimes even biting the animals' hooves or tails. Royal rat catchers were employed in some courts, much like the village ones, but better paid and more skilled. These men worked mostly at night, prowling the cellars with torches and ferrets. Their services were considered so vital that they sometimes received wages equal to kitchen staff. In royal accounts, their work is recorded alongside that of falconers and huntsmen, proof that even in the world of knights and kings, rats were an enemy worthy of professional pursuit. But rats were not just a nuisance. They were also symbols. In literature and heraldry, the rat became an image of corruption, of treachery, gnawing from within. To accuse someone of being a rat was to call them a betrayer, one who destroyed quietly from the shadows. This association may have been born from castle life itself, where rats undermined strength from beneath stone foundations, unseen until the damage was done. The metaphor was as physical as it was moral, the rat as the rot within the walls of power. Despite their best efforts, the nobles could not rid themselves of the creatures. Their very luxury ensured it. The endless supply of food and warmth made castles havens for infestation. Even the royal pets, small lapdogs and tame birds, were at risk. Some records tell of rats stealing chicks or biting the wings off doves kept in aviaries. In winter, when the cold drove rats indoors, servants would burn extra torches and keep cats in the great halls overnight. The faint glow of the firelight would flicker across the stone, casting long shadows of hunting cats and darting rats. It was a nightly battle played out in silence. The problem extended even to the upper reaches of faith and scholarship. Monasteries attached to castles suffered equally. Monks complained of rats gnawing through manuscripts, eating parchment, and destroying sacred texts. The tiny teeth left trails across the words of God, as if mocking the efforts of human devotion. Some monasteries built raised platforms for their books, while others stored their libraries in towers with narrow access points. But still, the rats found their way. Imagine, if you will, a cold night in a great castle. The feast has ended. The torches burn low. The nobles sleep behind heavy curtains, their breath visible in the chill air. Down below, the servants doze beside the embers of the kitchen hearth. The castle seems still, but it is not. Beneath the rushes, along the beams, within the walls, the true inhabitants move. You can hear them if you listen closely. The faint scratching of claws, the gnawing of wood, the soft squeak of tiny mouths. The fortress may stand against armies, but it cannot stand against them. The castle rat was more than a pest. It was a reminder of humility. Even the mightiest could not escape the smallest. In this way, rats united all classes, from the beggar in the alley to the king on his throne, in a common discomfort, a shared vulnerability. The plague had proven that death came for everyone, but even in peace, the rat remained a quiet equalizer. As time went on, rats found new realms to conquer. They didn't just thrive in towns and castles, they also ruled the sea. The next chapter carries us aboard the ships of the Middle Ages, where the struggle between man and rat continued on the open waves, in the holds of vessels bound for distant shores. If the medieval city was a paradise for rats, then the ships that carried goods across the world were their moving kingdoms. Nowhere did these creatures thrive more than aboard the great wooden vessels that bridged continents, bringing spices, silk, and death from one shore to another. The story of the medieval rat cannot be told without the sea, for it was on the creaking decks, and in the dark holds of merchant ships that rats became truly global. Wherever humans sailed, the rats followed. A medieval ship was the perfect home for them. Built of timber, sealed with pitch, and packed with grain, fruit, and salted meat, it offered everything a rat could want: food, warmth, and endless hiding places. The rats lived deep within the cargo holds, nesting in straw and gnawing at barrels. They climbed the rigging, scurried along ropes, and even slept among the sails. To sailors, they were constant companions, both hated and oddly familiar. A ship without rats, some believed, was a cursed ship. Their presence meant abundance. Their sudden disappearance meant bad luck or worse, a storm, a leak, or death. The relationship between sailor and rat was one of grudging coexistence. Sailors despised them for the noise, the damage, and the stench. Rats chewed through ropes, ruined provisions, and contaminated fresh-water barrels with their droppings. Yet, in the long monotony of sea voyages, they were also a grim comfort. Their skittering reminded men they were not entirely alone in the vast emptiness. At night, when the sea was black and endless, the sound of rats beneath the deck was strangely familiar, a reminder of home, even if home was filthy. Rats boarded ships easily. They came aboard hidden in cargo grain sacks, coiled ropes, or wooden crates, and quickly multiplied. A single breeding pair could turn into dozens within weeks. Once a ship reached port, the rats disembarked as easily as they had arrived, following the scent of food along the mooring lines. Thus, from one harbor to the next, they spread across the medieval world like stowaways of empire. Through them, the unseen contagions of the East reached the West. Through them, plague rode the waves. Life at sea made rat infestations uniquely dangerous. Food was precious, and losing supplies to rats could mean starvation before landfall. Sailors developed endless strategies to fight them. Cats were common aboard ship's sleek, sure-footed hunters who kept balance even on a pitching deck. Some captains considered cats essential crew members and forbade their mistreatment. If a ship's cat died, sailors sometimes held a small ceremony before replacing it, fearful that the rats would take it as a sign of weakness. Traps were also used, though crude by modern standards. Sailors crafted wooden boxes that snapped shut with pegs and string. They baited them with bits of meat or cheese, checked them daily, and tossed the dead rats overboard. Yet the sea had its limits. The rats bred faster than the traps could catch them, and in the endless dark below deck, there were always more waiting. Some ships even developed their own ecosystem. Rats feeding on the food stores, fleas on the rats, and humans on both. There were tales of strange alliances, too. Some sailors claimed the rats could sense storms and abandon ships before disaster struck. When rats were seen fleeing down the ropes at port, the crew took it as a dire omen, a sign of a doomed voyage. This belief was so strong that it survived into later centuries, giving rise to the phrase, like rats leaving a sinking ship. Whether true or not, sailors swore by it. They had seen too many ships vanish into the depths after the rats disappeared. Despite the hardship they caused, rats became part of the rhythm of sea life. The scratching in the hull, the soft squeak in the dark, were as familiar as the crash of waves or the creak of wood. Some sailors even grew superstitious affection for them, tossing crumbs to ship rats for luck. They said the creatures knew the sea better than any man, and that to harm them was to anger the spirits of the deep. In this way, the rats gained a strange immortality in maritime lore, half pest, half omen, always present. But not all ships survived their infestations. In the confined space of a vessel, rats spread not just disease, but destruction. They chewed through rope and canvas, weakening sails and rigging. They ate through water casks, contaminating the supply with filth. In the hot southern seas, their bodies bred lice and fleas that tormented the crew. Some ships returned to port, carrying little more than bones and barrels, half the crew dead from sickness, the rest gaunt from hunger. The rats, of course, thrived. They left the ship as fat as kings, ready to colonize the next dock, the next town, the next kingdom. Imagine standing on a moonlit deck in the 14th century. The ocean stretches in every direction, black and endless. The sails groan in the wind. The only other sound is the soft, rhythmic tapping from below deck, the gnawing of tiny teeth on wood. A sailor pauses, listening, his hand tightening on the rope. He spits over the side and mutters a prayer. To him, that sound is more than nuisance. It's a whisper from fate, the voice of the unseen world that always seems one step ahead of man. Through rats, the sea became the great highway of plague and superstition alike. Every ship that left the east carried more than goods. It carried potential doom. Every port that welcomed trade invited infestation. And as the world grew more connected, so too did the empire of the rat. But while sailors and merchants waged their endless war against these creatures, another kind of battle unfolded on land, one waged not with traps or torches, but with words, symbols, and rituals. In the next chapter, we enter the world of curses and charms, where medieval people turned to magic itself to drive the rats away. When traps failed, poisons killed more people than rats, and the church's blessings brought no relief. Medieval people turned to the only other power they believed might help them: magic. In an age when the world felt ruled by unseen forces, angels and demons, saints and spirits, it seemed only natural that the creatures of the dark could be fought with words, symbols, and spells. The battle against rats was not merely physical. It was spiritual. And so, across Europe, people whispered incantations, drew circles in the dirt, and called upon higher powers or stranger ones to drive the vermin away. Magic in the Middle Ages was a tangled thing. It existed in the space between faith and heresy, between medicine and superstition. Many of the charms against rats were rooted in folk traditions far older than Christianity. Passed down through generations, they blended ancient pagan customs with the new language of saints and scripture. The idea was simple. If rats were messengers of evil, they could be commanded to leave in the name of something greater, whether that was God, nature, or the earth itself. One of the most common forms of magical rat control was the asterisk banishment charm asterisk. These spells were often written on parchment or recited aloud in a specific pattern. A farmer might stand in the middle of his field at dusk and call out to the rats as if addressing an enemy army. "Rats, I command thee." One such charm began, "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, depart from this place and go to the wilderness where no man dwells." Sometimes the charm was followed by a gesture throwing a handful of soil over one shoulder or drawing a cross in the air. In rural France and Switzerland, there are even records of priests holding formal excommunication ceremonies for rats. The creatures were symbolically summoned to court, accused of crimes against the people, and sentenced to leave under penalty of divine wrath. The absurdity of such acts did not strike medieval minds as strange. To them, the moral order of the world was absolute. If humans could be punished for disobedience, so could the vermin that threatened their survival. Ordinary people used humbler methods. In villages from England to Bohemia, housewives scratched protective symbols into doorframes, hoping to keep the rats from crossing the threshold. Some tied small crosses made of straw above their pantries, while others hung sprigs of herbs mint, tansy, rue to repel evil spirits and foul creatures alike. Children were taught to spit 3 times upon the ground when they saw a rat, or to make the sign of the cross over any hole in the floor. These small rituals gave comfort, a sense that something could be done in a world that so often felt helpless. Some of the most curious remedies involved direct negotiation with the rats themselves. A common belief held that if you treated the rats with respect and spoke politely, they might obey. Farmers would leave letters for them, tiny scraps of parchment inscribed with pleas such as, "Good neighbors, I pray you, leave my grain in peace and take your fill elsewhere." These letters were placed near the rats' holes, sometimes with a small offering of food. The logic was strange, but consistent with medieval thought. Everything in creation had its place and its dignity, even pests. By acknowledging their existence and appealing to their better nature, one might restore balance. In darker corners of society, magic took on more dangerous forms. Witchcraft accusations often began with vermin. A milkmaid whose cows stopped giving milk might be accused of sending rats to curse a rival. A farmer whose harvest was eaten could suspect his neighbor of casting a spell. Rat charms, found in later trial records, often included bizarre ingredients: the ashes of burned cats, powdered bones, blood mixed with wine, or even parts of the rats themselves. Some witches were said to keep rats as familiar spiritual companions who acted as spies or messengers. Whether any of these tales were true hardly mattered. To the frightened and the faithful, rats became symbols of the unnatural and the unholy. Monks and priests sometimes used holy words in similar ways. They carved prayers into wooden tablets and buried them at the edges of fields or under granary doors. The Latin phrase *pestis, recede, *plague, depart, was often repeated, sometimes followed by verses from the Psalms. Candlelight processions wound through infested towns, with the clergy chanting blessings while villagers sprinkled holy water along the streets. The rituals may have done little to move the rats, but they calmed human hearts. In Germany and the Low Countries, some rat charms were half prayer, half poem. One medieval rhyme read, "Rats and mice, I conjure you, by bread and by salt, depart and be true. Take not from here what man hath stored. Go to the forest in peace with the Lord." Recited at twilight, it was meant to guide the rats away gently, without angering them. In these words, there is an almost touching humility, a recognition that humanity shared its world with forces it could neither fully control nor comprehend. Of course, not all who practiced these rituals escaped suspicion. In times of famine or plague, when rats devoured what little remained, anyone who claimed power over them risked being labeled a witch. Some were punished, others driven away. Fear made the boundary between healer and heretic perilously thin. Yet even amid superstition, there were glimpses of understanding. People noticed that rats avoided smoke, noise, and light. Bonfires were sometimes lit to drive them from barns. Bells were rung, and pots were beaten to make them flee. Though dressed in the garb of magic, these actions hinted at practical observation. The medieval mind did not separate magic from science. They were both attempts to understand and influence the mysterious world. Imagine the scene: a farmer standing in his field at dusk, holding a small candle shielded from the wind. Around him, the earth is quiet except for the faint rustle of movement underground. He murmurs a few words, a blend of prayer and plea, and presses a charm into the soil. Then he turns homeward, believing, for tonight at least, that his grain will be spared. The rats, of course, do not heed his words. But perhaps he sleeps a little easier, convinced that faith or magic or both stand guard over his harvest. In this way, the charms and curses of the Middle Ages were not merely foolish, they were human. They gave meaning to fear and structure to chaos. But as the centuries passed and the plagues faded, the world began to change. A new age of discovery and reason dawned, bringing light into the dark corners of ignorance. The old superstitions began to crumble, replaced by something new: curiosity. And as people began to observe the world more closely, the rat once again became an object of fascination, not just a pest, but a subject of study. The next chapter explores how the changing attitudes of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance slowly transformed the rat from a symbol of sin into a creature of science. Rats were more than a nuisance, they were an economic force. Every gnawed grain sack, every spoiled barrel, every ruined harvest carried a cost. To the medieval world, already balanced precariously between abundance and famine, those small, unseen losses could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The story of rats in the Middle Ages was not only one of fear and superstition, it was a story of money, trade, and the fragile economy of a world forever at risk from hunger. In an era when nearly everyone lived close to the edge of subsistence, The damage caused by rats was devastating. Grain was life. It fed the people, the livestock, and the armies. Villages stored it in communal barns, while cities kept reserves in granaries and warehouses. A good harvest meant hope. Bad one brought anxiety. Rats turned abundance into scarcity, reducing whole stores to worthless husks overnight. They ate not only the grain, but also fouled what they did not finish, leaving droppings and disease in their wake. A single rat could contaminate more food than it consumed. Medieval chroniclers recorded the economic toll with despair. In the market towns of England and France, merchants complained that rats had ruined barrels of flour before they could be sold. Millers lost entire loads of wheat to infestations, their profits eaten away along with the grain. Shipowners reported that cargo spoiled before reaching port, the holds crawling with vermin. The cost of replacement was ruinous, and the price of food climbed. In years of poor harvest, rat infestations could tip a region from hunger into famine. The peasantry bore the brunt of this loss. A poor family might store their grain in a simple chest or clay jar, sealed as best they could. But rats could chew through wood, climb walls, and even burrow into earthen floors. What began as a few missing handfuls of grain could become a disaster by winter's end. When the stores ran empty, people sold possessions, begged from neighbors, or resorted to eating acorns, bark, or even carrion. The rats, meanwhile, grew fat. It was a cruel reversal. While humans starved, the pests thrived on what remained. The damage extended beyond the fields and homes to the broader network of trade. Merchant guilds issued strict regulations to protect their goods. In London, Bruges, and Venice, officials inspected warehouses for signs of infestation. If rat droppings or gnawed sacks were found, the owner could be fined or lose his license to trade. In ports, rats were notorious stowaways, and cities built barriers to keep them from spreading simple wooden planks at first, later iron rat guards on mooring ropes. But enforcement was uneven, and corruption was common. For every merchant who obeyed the rules, another bribed his way past inspection, bringing rats with his goods. Even castles and monastery centers of power and wealth faced economic consequences. Their cellars and granaries stored vast amounts of food and tithes, all vulnerable to infestation. Monks recorded the loss of flour and parchment in their accounts, treating it as an expected expense. Royal treasurers noted the same. The English royal household, for instance, often included costs for rat wardens or pest measures in their budgets. A quiet acknowledgement that no amount of silver could keep the rats entirely at bay. For farmers, the constant threat of rats changed how they worked and lived. Many began storing grain in elevated bins or granaries raised on stone pillars, an architectural feature that can still be seen in some medieval barns today. The stones were often shaped like discs, designed to keep rats from climbing upward. It was a small but clever innovation, one of the few defenses that truly worked. Others used cats or dogs as part of the household economy, feeding them just enough to ensure they stayed and hunted. The presence of a good mouser could save a family's livelihood. Yet even these precautions had limits. Rats were persistent and adaptable. When food ran short in one place, they moved on to another, following the scent of harvest through the countryside. Their migrations mirrored trade itself, flowing along the same routes as grain and goods. The medieval world's growing economy, the rise of towns, markets, and merchant fleets, was the very thing that allowed rats to flourish. Prosperity fed them as surely as poverty did. There was, in some places, a grim sort of commerce in the rats themselves. Rat catchers sold their services to towns, collecting payment for every carcass they brought in. Some even sold the skins for clothing linings or the tails for proof of work. A few unscrupulous catchers were rumored to breed rats secretly, ensuring a steady supply for future employment. Whether true or not, such stories reflected the uneasy dependence between humans and their pests. The rat was an enemy, but one that also created work, trade, and stories. The economic impact rippled into art and literature as well. Rats became symbols of greed and corruption, creatures that devoured wealth from within. In moral plays, they stood for dishonest merchants or corrupt officials. To accuse someone of being a rat was to suggest they ate away at society's goodness for personal gain. The metaphor was powerful, born from the real fear of scarcity and loss. Imagine a bustling medieval market near the end of autumn. The air smells of grain and smoke. Merchants shout over one another, their tables piled high with barley and wheat. Somewhere beneath the stalls, unseen, a few small shapes move. A sack shifts ever so slightly. A faint squeak rises beneath the din. By nightfall, when the candles burn low and the doors are locked, the rats will feast. By morning, a merchant will discover the gnawed hole in his stockpile and the fine dust of spilled grain at his feet. His profit for the season gone. The rats were not villains in the way people imagined them. They were opportunists, thriving on the waste and abundance of humankind. In doing so, they revealed the delicate balance of the medieval economy. How closely comfort bordered our ruin, how quickly plenty could turn to hunger. The more humans built, stored, and traded, the more the rats followed, invisible partners in the progress of civilization. By the late Middle Ages, this uneasy relationship began to change. Trade grew larger, cities denser, and knowledge broader. Observers started to wonder not just how to destroy rats, but why they came in the first place. A shift was stirring, one that would lead from fear and superstition toward curiosity and control. In the next chapter, we'll see how these changing attitudes took shape, how the Renaissance mind, with its thirst for knowledge, began to look at the rat not as a demon or curse, but as a creature to be understood and eventually conquered. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Europe began to awaken from centuries of superstition and darkness. Curiosity replaced fear, and the world itself, once viewed as a stage for divine punishment, became an object of wonder. Artists, philosophers, and naturalists turned their gaze not just to the heavens, but to the smallest corners of creation. Slowly, haltingly, the human eye began to see the rat not as an omen or a curse, but as a living creature, part of a complex and interconnected world. It was not an easy transition. Old beliefs do not die quietly, and the rat's image as a bringer of disease and decay clung stubbornly to the human imagination. Even in the 15th and 16th centuries, the idea that rats were born from filth or sent by demons remained common. But among the educated and the curious, a new question began to take root. What if these creatures were not symbols, but subjects? What if understanding them could reveal something about nature itself? The seeds of this change lay in observation. The Renaissance, with its renewed interest in empirical study, encouraged people to watch and record rather than simply believe. Naturalists and physicians began writing detailed accounts of animals and their habits, not as moral lessons, but as facts. They studied where rats nested, how they bred, what they ate, and how they moved. For the first time, rats appeared in scholarly works, not as monsters, but as species. In Italy, scholars inspired by Aristotle and Pliny re-examined the natural histories of animals. They sought to separate truth from legend. Though they still lacked microscopes and germ theory, they began to grasp the idea of biological cause and effect. Rats, they noted, appeared wherever food and waste gathered. Rather than being born from corruption, they were drawn to it. It was a subtle shift, but a revolutionary one. The beginning of ecology, centuries before it existed. Art mirrored this new curiosity. Painters of the Renaissance, obsessed with realism, began to include rats and mice in their still life compositions. In Dutch and Flemish paintings, a rat nibbling on bread or hiding beneath a table was a reminder of the fragility of abundance. A moral echo, yes, but also a record of life as it was. The rat, once banished to the margins of illuminated manuscripts as a symbol of sin, now crept quietly into the center of the canvas, rendered with the same care as a piece of fruit or a human hand. Scientific thought advanced too. Early anatomists dissected rats alongside frogs and birds, using their small bodies to study the mysteries of muscle and bone. Though these studies were crude, they revealed something profound, that all creatures shared a common design. In understanding the rat, one could glimpse the pattern of creation itself. To the Renaissance thinker, this was not heresy, it was wonder. God's perfection, they reasoned, could be found not only in the stars, but in the smallest creatures scurrying underfoot. At the same time, practical attitudes toward rats began to harden. As cities grew, the need for public cleanliness became impossible to ignore. The old tolerance of filth, the medieval acceptance that dirt was inevitable, gave way to the Renaissance ideal of order. Town councils passed laws regulating waste disposal and food storage. Market inspectors enforced cleanliness in stalls. Physicians advised that keeping streets and homes clean would preserve health. They still believed in miasma, the poisonous air of decay, but their actions had real consequences. Fewer open sewers meant fewer rats. For the first time, civic pride and public hygiene began to intertwine. The rat catcher, too, evolved with the times. Once a wandering tradesman, he became a more professional figure. Records from the 16th century show city-employed exterminators paid regular wages to patrol markets and warehouses. Their methods improved slightly better traps, safer poisons, and more organized campaigns. What had once been a grim trade now became an early form of public health work. The line between rat catcher and city official blurred, marking one of the first steps toward modern pest control. Yet even as knowledge grew, the emotional shadow of the rat endured. The memory of the Black Death was too deep to erase. The rat still haunted dreams, stories, and fears. In literature, it remained a creature of the night, a symbol of corruption and the hidden dangers of prosperity. Shakespeare's age, though steeped in new learning, still cursed the cutpurse rat and the damp and unclean thing that slipped through cracks unseen. The tension between fascination and disgust, science and superstition, defined Europe's evolving relationship with the rat. Still, progress continued. Travelers and explorers carried both rats and ideas across the world. Ships bound for the New World brought infestations to distant shores, but also brought scholars who studied the creatures in foreign lands. The rat became a global citizen, despised yet indispensable to the story of human expansion. Where people built, the rats followed. Where they farmed, the rats feasted. In this strange partnership, both species thrived, one knowingly, the other not. Imagine a scholarly study in Florence around the year 1500. The room smells faintly of parchment and candle wax. Books are stacked high upon the table, their bindings cracked from use. In one corner, a small cage holds a pair of rats captured from the city streets. The scholar watches them quietly, noting their movements, their cleverness, their restless energy. He does not curse them or fear them. Instead, he writes, "These creatures live as we do, in company, and seek what comfort they may." In that single sentence lies the dawn of empathy, the recognition that even the lowest form of life shares in the mystery of existence. The changing attitudes of the Renaissance did not redeem the rat, but they reframed it. From monster to subject, from curse to curiosity, the rat began to occupy a new place in human thought. It was no longer only an intruder. It was a mirror, a reflection of man's own adaptability, persistence, and hunger to survive. And as this new understanding grew, it set the stage for the centuries to come, when the war against rats would move from superstition to science, from prayer to experiment. The final chapter of this story will bring us full circle, from the filth of the medieval streets to the legacy those times left behind. For the rat's tale did not end with the Middle Ages. It continues to this day, a shadow in the corners of our history and our homes. The story of the medieval rat does not end with the fading of the Middle Ages. Its legacy still echoes in every city street, every creak in an old house, and every shiver that runs down the spine when we glimpse something small and dark darting into shadow. The rat has followed humanity across centuries, adaptable, invisible, and indestructible. To understand its legacy is to understand ourselves, our fears, our resilience, and the uneasy partnership we have shared with this most persistent of creatures. By the time Europe emerged into the light of the Renaissance, the rat had already shaped the course of human history in ways few other animals ever could. It had tested the limits of our endurance during the Black Death, forced the development of sanitation and pest control, and altered the way we thought about health, cleanliness, and responsibility. In its quiet, relentless way, the rat became a teacher, a grim one, but a teacher nonetheless. The very idea of public health, the recognition that disease and cleanliness are shared matters, was born from centuries of battling vermin in the dark. The economic and social changes the rat provoked were profound. Towns and cities began to see filth not as an inevitable part of life, but as a threat to prosperity. Waste disposal became a civic duty. Streets were swept, sewers improved, and storage methods refined. The lessons learned from the medieval rat's havoc shaped the modern city itself. Even today, the design of grain silos, warehouses, and ships owes something to the long war against the unseen teeth of the past. But beyond the practical, the rat left its mark on the collective imagination. It became a creature of contradiction, reviled and revered, despised yet admired for its cunning and will to survive. In folklore and literature, the rat continued to carry the weight of medieval symbolism. It appeared in moral tales as a thief, a trickster, a symbol of decay. Yet over time, that image began to soften. As the Enlightenment brought reason to bear upon fear, the rat's persistence came to be seen as a reflection of life's tenacity. Even in ruin, it survived. Even in pestilence, it endured. Science, too, found new uses for the rat. By the 18th and 19th centuries, its adaptability made it invaluable to researchers studying anatomy, behavior, and medicine. The same creature that once represented filth and death became an instrument of progress, helping humans unlock the secrets of the body and the mind. In laboratories, rats became symbols not of corruption, but of curiosity, the perfect partners in humankind's endless quest to understand life. It was an ironic twist, and perhaps a fitting one. The rat, which had once carried disease, now carried knowledge. Still, the shadow of its medieval image remains. Modern cities wage the same war fought by peasants and nobles 1,000 years ago. Poison and traps have replaced charms and prayers, yet the goal is unchanged: to keep the unseen under control. Every health inspector, every sanitation worker, every city ordinance against waste is a descendant of those early, desperate measures. The rat, in turn, has evolved alongside us faster, cleverer, always a step ahead. We built walls. It learned to climb. We sealed our food. It learned to gnaw. The battle continues, quiet but eternal. Culturally, the rat has become a mirror of fear itself. In movies, books, and art, it represents the dark side of civilization, the reminder that beneath every shining city lies a shadow. Yet it also reminds us of endurance, of adaptation, of the shared stubbornness of all living things. The rat does not seek war with humanity. It simply survives as we do, finding its place in the cracks of our progress. In its story, we glimpse our own, thriving amid change, feeding on the remains of what came before, and finding ways to endure. If one walks through the ruins of a medieval town today, down the narrow cobbled streets, past the crumbling walls and the faint outlines of old granaries, it is easy to imagine the world as it was. The air thick with smoke and the scent of tallow, the sound of carts and church bells, and beneath it all, the soft rustle of something small and unseen. That sound is the heartbeat of history, a reminder that civilization has always been built side by side with the creatures we try to forget. In the end, the legacy of the medieval rat is not just one of disease or destruction, but of transformation. It forced humanity to evolve, to clean, to question, to observe. It taught us, unwillingly, that ignorance carries a price and that survival demands understanding. Every lesson of science and sanitation, every advance in medicine, carries within it the faint echo of that first scratching in the walls of a medieval home. And so, the rat remains an eternal traveler in the wake of humanity, following our ships, our cities, our ambitions. It has outlasted kings and empires, plagues and wars. It was there in the huts of peasants and the halls of kings, in the darkness of the plague years, and in the bright light of the modern lab. Its story is our story, written not in words but in survival. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine the world as it once was: stone streets and flickering torches, the scent of bread cooling by the hearth, and the quiet sound of tiny feet somewhere in the dark. That sound, faint and constant, is history whispering to you. The rats are still there, just beyond the edge of the light, reminding us that no matter how far we've come, the past is never entirely gone. It scurries beside us, small but unyielding, waiting for the world to fall quiet again. And so, our journey through the shadowed corners of the Middle Ages comes to an end. We've walked the narrow streets of medieval towns, climbed into castle cellars, sailed across dark seas, and stood in candlelit chapels, all in the company of one small, persistent creature that never once let go of its hold on history. The rat was more than a pest. It was a silent witness to humanity's struggles, fears, and triumphs. It saw our darkest hours and our moments of rebirth. And in its survival, we can trace the story of our own. In every age, humans have tried to escape what they fear most: disease, decay, the unknown that stirs in the dark. But in learning to fight the rats, we learned something about ourselves. We discovered science, sanitation, and empathy. We built stronger homes, cleaner cities, and better systems of health, all because of the quiet battle that began in the flickering light of a medieval hearth. The rats never meant to teach us, but they did, and the lessons endure even now. If you listen closely tonight, you might imagine that ancient sound again, the faint scratch in the walls, the echo of a presence that has followed humanity through every century. But there's no need for fear. Those sounds belong to history now, softened by distance, their edges worn smooth by time. The world is cleaner, wiser, and brighter, though not entirely free of its shadows. The rats remain, just as we remain resilient, restless, and endlessly alive. If you've enjoyed this calm journey through the past, I invite you to stay with us in this quiet corner of history. Please take a moment to subscribe to Asterisk History for Sleep Asterisk, where the stories of forgotten times unfold slowly and gently, guiding you into rest. Your support helps us bring more of these serene explorations to life, one tale at a time. And I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Were there moments that surprised you, or that made you see history in a new light? Let me know in the comments, along with when and where you listen. I read every message, and your thoughts help shape where we travel next. For now, let the candles burn low. The streets are quiet, the fire has faded to embers, and the world of the Middle Ages drifts into silence once more. The scratching in the dark grows fainter until it's gone. Rest well, traveler. Tomorrow, there will be new stories waiting in the quiet corridors of history. Until then, sleep softly and dream of the past.